The difference in exposure to shit in their environments could explain. Good afternoon, friends. In this video, I'm going to tell you just how bad shit really is in India. But before I do, please subscribe to the channel if you're not already, like the video, and comment on the video to help the channel. Now let's get started. First of all, some background. For those that don't know, human height is very much determined by our socioeconomic circumstances. This is the reason human height has been elevating around the world over the last 2 centuries. However, countries that still have poor socioeconomic circumstances, like countries in sub-Saharan Africa and some countries in South Asia, still have lower heights than their equivalent Western counterparts in terms of their potential for absolute height. What this practically means is that there are children growing up in sub-Saharan Africa and in India that will grow to heights that are lower than what they could have been if they had enough food and resources. Classically, this reduction in height is called growth stunting, and it's really defined as being 2 standard deviations below the average height for your age. Now, what this video about is one specific observation about this growth stunting, particularly that children who grow up in India are much shorter than their counterparts growing up in sub-Saharan Africa, even when adjusted for their respective resources. What this means is that children in India with an equal opportunity to consume food still grow up much shorter than their African counterparts. This puzzling observation has been called the Asian Enigma, and in this video I'm going to tell you why it happens. But before we start, India's health in general hasn't recovered as much as its economic progress would naturally indicate. For example, although only 19%, and that's a big figure by the way because India has so many people, 19% of worldwide births occur in India, although 27% of neonatal deaths occur in India, a disproportionate number. A similar kind of disproportionate incidence of anemia can be found in India, where in sub-Saharan Africa, due to the incidence of malaria, we would expect much higher rates of anemia, whereas they're actually much higher in India. And these effects are not restricted toward a certain gender. So for example, although around 40% of Indian mothers that are recently pregnant are actually underweight, around 20% of working age Indian males are also underweight, indicating that likely socially constrained resources are not entirely to blame for the reasons behind this ill health. In particular, this likely indicates that something else in the environment of modern Indians is causing their ill health. But speaking more specifically about height, between the years of 1995 and 2005, India experienced 6% economic growth on average per year. On the other hand, the stunting of growth of Indian children only declined by an average of 1.3%. In fact, India's stunted growth is so extreme that it has caused undue criticism of India's economic progress, because many measures of economic progress are actually done via the size of children, such that these proxies for childhood malnutrition make us think that India is poorer than it really is. This lag between the height improvement in India and the economic improvement has been called the Asian Enigma, and it was finally solved last year. Now, previous approaches to solving this problem have included weighing the effects of vegetarian diets, which by the way have a very small but significant effect on the height of children, and weighing the effects, for example, of first order preference. That means preferring your firstborn child and giving them better resources, which partially explained the effect. But no analysis was able to completely explain this disparate effect, particularly when comparing Indian children to sub-Saharan African children. And the reason none of these approaches could explain the Asian Enigma is because none took into account the unique position of India in the world in terms of its sanitation. In particular, India has by far the worst sanitation per its socioeconomic status in the world. To put this into perspective, over 1 billion people in the world defecate in the open. That means over 1 billion people use the bathroom, do number 2, out in the wild. Moreover, most of these 1 billion people who defecate out in the open are actually Indian, and most Indians defecate out in the open. In fact, to put that even more into perspective, only 11 countries in the entire world have higher open air defecation rates than India, and together they account for only 8% of India's population. And this is not entirely due to economic circumstances. In particular, it appears to be that the caste system in India, which has sort of a ritualization of purity and impurity, may be affecting people's willingness to use bathrooms. In particular in India, even among households that have what are called latrines. A latrine is a kind of non-running water bathroom in which essentially the people defecate into a hole that has a long tunnel, keeping the feces away from the humans. Even among households that have latrines in India, people will still choose to go out in public and defecate out in the open. And academics think that the reason Indians will choose to do this is because of the fears over having to clean the latrine, which normally is cleaned once in every few years in these kind of socioeconomic circumstances. But even that is too concerning for the Indian families. In particular, the lower caste families are not willing to do that kind of work anymore because it's not seen to be worth the economic outcome, whereas upper caste families are too concerned about doing it because of the symbolic ritual impurity of the event. So essentially, this seems to cause a socially induced fear of using latrines and instead leads a lot of people to use the bathroom outside. This theory is evidenced by a paper that shows that in villages that practice what's called untouchability, the lower castes are considered untouchables in traditional Hindu society. In villages that practice untouchability, there is more open air defecation than in villages that don't practice it. So essentially, India has a lot of shit in it and a lot of people are shitting outside in India. But how does that affect their height? Well, first of all, I'd like to point out that it's long been known that hygiene interventions can improve development. So for example, in the American South, the eradication of the hookworm led to improved learning and economic productivity. Note that contact with fecal matter is very much associated with hookworm incidents. And a recent review of the causes of the improvement of height around the world found that one of the biggest causes wasn't just increased protein consumption in the diet, but rather reduced disease burden. In fact, exposure to human excrement, as is seen in India, may have direct effects. So for example, it's long been known that diarrhea, which can be induced by exposure to fecal matter, can cause the stunting of growth in children. But there can also be indirect effects. So for example, exposure to human excrement in the long term can have a chronic but subclinical effect on our ability to absorb nutrients and on, for example, our intestinal permeability to pathogens. This could affect children directly, or it could affect their mothers, in turn affecting children. So for example, a child's IGF-1 level is predictive of its health, but its IGF-1 level is associated with the mother's inflammatory status. So for example, in India, mothers being exposed to fecal excrement out in the open may develop higher inflammatory levels, thereby causing their children to underdevelop even before they leave the womb. Confirming this, it's recently been shown that poor sanitation in India seems to affect the growth of all ages of children, not just the very young ages between 1 to 5, but also in pubertal years and so on. Finally, we get to the paper that I want to discuss, which is this wonderful 2020 econometric paper. That is a quantitative analysis done by quantitative economists on the gap between India's growth and sub-Saharan Africa. This paper found that this gap can be entirely explained by the difference in sanitation between sub-Saharan Africa and India, such that the increased exposure to fecal elements in the environment entirely explains the Asian enigma. Not only that, but the increased exposure to open air excrement in India could even predict the mother's health in India, explaining how this could happen at multi-generational levels. After the authors of this paper discovered that the open air excrement may be the causal determinant between the differences in growth in sub-Saharan Africa and India, they performed a meta-analysis of previous studies. There they found that the difference in exposure to open air excrement, and basically the difference in exposure to shit in their environments, could explain 0.14 standard deviations of the Indian children's growth, which is more than the observed gap between the sub-Saharan African children's height and the Indian children's height, meaning that it explains more than enough of their gap. Essentially, this means that the difference in exposure to shit in India and Africa is so wide that even if that exposure to shit had a very small effect on the height velocity of the children, it would still be enough to explain the difference between Indian children and African children. Anyway, friends, this was a short video. I just wanted to introduce you to the Asian enigma and its surprising cause. shit. For those that think we're being too careful about our hygiene and our exposure to viruses and bacteria, you might want to think again. There's a reason we're so careful. This example from India gives us a glimpse back into our past, where shit hurt us so much it made us shorter. Anyway friends, I hope you found this video somewhat interesting, and I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow morning.